The steel target stood at 3,000 meters, an impossible distance. No human alive can hit that consistently in these Alpine winds, Instructor Müller declared, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades training Switzerland's finest marksmen. The wind howled down from the Matterhorn at 40 km per hour, making even experienced snipers abandon attempts beyond 1,500 meters. 20 elite military trainees nodded in solemn agreement as they struggled with much closer targets. None of them noticed the old shepherd standing on the distant slope, leaning on his walking stick, watching silently as his sheep grazed nearby. In the moment between Müller's confident proclamation and his next instruction, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Something that would transform everything these soldiers thought they knew about precision, patience, and the legends hidden in plain sight among Switzerland's ancient mountains. Before we dive into this remarkable story from the Swiss Alps, tell me in the comments, from which corner of the world are you watching today? Are you viewing from the mountains of Colorado, the plains of Kansas, the hills of Tuscany, or perhaps somewhere I've never imagined? If you believe that true legends often walk among us unrecognized, please subscribe to Silent Legends. We bring light to the extraordinary stories of ordinary people whose quiet courage changed the world in ways history almost forgot. This is the story of Hans Zimmermann, and the day the mountains remembered their greatest guardian. The Thun Military Training Center sat nestled in a valley beneath the towering peaks of the Bernese Oberland, its ranges carved into mountainsides that had witnessed centuries of Swiss marksmanship tradition. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Instructor Müller, a precise man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had never missed an important shot, prepared his students for what he called reality education. Today, gentlemen, we explore the limits of human capability, Müller announced in accented English, addressing the international group of military specialists who had come to Switzerland to learn Alpine warfare techniques. That target at 3,000 meters represents the theoretical maximum range for precision shooting under ideal conditions. He gestured toward a steel plate barely visible on the distant mountainside, a speck that seemed to dance in the thermal currents rising from the valley. Notice I said ideal conditions. Today, we have wind gusts to 45 km per hour, variable air density due to altitude changes, and thermal turbulence that makes accurate calculation nearly impossible. The 20 trainees, representing special forces units from Germany, France, Austria, and Italy, listened with the intensity of men whose lives might depend on understanding these limitations. Each had already proven himself exceptional in his home country. Here, in the Swiss Alps, they were students again. Lieutenant Klaus Weber from the German KSK raised his hand. Instructor, what is the longest confirmed kill shot in these mountains? Müller's expression grew thoughtful. Officially, 2,400 meters, achieved by a Swiss Army sniper in perfect conditions 3 years ago. Unofficially. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the surrounding peaks. There are stories from the war years. Tales of shots made at distances that strain credibility. But these are mountain legends, not documented military history. What Müller didn't see was the figure watching from approximately 800 meters up the slope. Hans Zimmermann appeared to be nothing more than an elderly shepherd, perhaps 70 years old, wearing the traditional thick wool jacket and weathered hat of someone who had spent his life in these mountains. His sheep grazed peacefully around him as he observed the military training with what seemed like idle curiosity. But Hans's eyes held a quality that would have given Müller pause had he noticed. They were the eyes of someone who measured distances instinctively, who read wind patterns in the movement of grass and gauged air density by the color of shadows on distant peaks. The training began with targets at 800 meters, a distance that would challenge most civilian shooters but was well within the capabilities of these elite soldiers. One by one, they took their positions, adjusting for wind and elevation, consulting rangefinders and ballistic calculators with the methodical precision of professionals. Sergeant André Moreau of the French Special Forces achieved a respectable grouping, all shots within a 15-centimeter circle. Acceptable, Müller commented, making notes on his tablet. But remember, in combat, acceptable means your target lives to fight another day. As the distances increased to 1,200 meters, then 1,500, the groups began to spread. The Alpine wind proved especially challenging, shifting direction with the mountain thermals, creating updrafts and downdrafts that could push a bullet several meters off target. Captain Giovanni Rossi from Italy's 9th Parachute Assault Regiment managed 3 hits out of 5 at 1,800 meters, earning grudging approval from Muller. Better. But notice how the wind has increased. At 2,000 meters, these same conditions would make consistent accuracy nearly impossible. Hans Zimmermann had been watching this progression with growing interest. From his vantage point, he could see things the soldiers below could not, the way the wind currents flowed around the mountain faces, creating predictable patterns that repeated every 15 to 20 minutes. The way thermal columns rose from sun-warmed rock faces, creating vertical air currents that could be read by someone who understood the mountain's moods. The Thun Military Training Center sat nestled in a valley beneath the towering peaks of the Bernese Oberland, its ranges carved into mountainsides that had witnessed centuries of Swiss marksmanship tradition. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Instructor Muller, a precise man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had never missed an important shot, prepared his students for what he called reality education. Today, gentlemen, we explore the limits of human capability, Muller announced in accented English, addressing the international group of military specialists who had come to Switzerland to learn Alpine warfare techniques. That target at 3,000 meters represents the theoretical maximum range for precision shooting under ideal conditions. He gestured toward a steel plate barely visible on the distant mountainside, a speck that seemed to dance in the thermal currents rising from the valley. Notice I said ideal conditions. Today, we have wind gusts to 45 km per hour, variable air density due to altitude changes, and thermal turbulence that makes accurate calculation nearly impossible. The 20 trainees, representing special forces units from Germany, France, Austria, and Italy, listened with the intensity of men whose lives might depend on understanding these limitations. Each had already proven himself exceptional in his home country. Here, in the Swiss Alps, they were students again. Lieutenant Klaus Weber from the German KSK raised his hand. Instructor, what is the longest confirmed kill shot in these mountains? Muller's expression grew thoughtful. Officially, 2,400 meters, achieved by a Swiss Army sniper in perfect conditions 3 years ago. Unofficially. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the surrounding peaks. There are stories from the war years. Tales of shots made at distances that strain credibility. But these are mountain legends, not documented military history. What Muller didn't see was the figure watching from approximately 800 meters up the slope. Hans Zimmermann appeared to be nothing more than an elderly shepherd, perhaps 70 years old, wearing the traditional thick wool jacket and weathered hat of someone who had spent his life in these mountains. His sheep grazed peacefully around him as he observed the military training with what seemed like idle curiosity. But Hans's eyes held a quality that would have given Muller pause had he noticed. They were the eyes of someone who measured distances instinctively, who read wind patterns in the movement of grass and gauged air density by the color of shadows on distant peaks. The training began with targets at 800 meters, a distance that would challenge most civilian shooters but was well within the capabilities of these elite soldiers. One by one, they took their positions, adjusting for wind and elevation, consulting rangefinders and ballistic calculators with the methodical precision of professionals. Sergeant André Moreau of the French Special Forces achieved a respectable grouping, all shots within a 15-centimeter circle. Acceptable, Muller commented, making notes on his tablet. But remember, in combat, acceptable means your target lives to fight another day. As the distances increased to 1,200 meters, then 1,500, the groups began to spread. The Alpine wind proved especially challenging, shifting direction with the mountain thermals, creating updrafts and downdrafts that could push a bullet several meters off target. Captain Giovanni Rossi from Italy's 9th Parachute Assault Regiment managed 3 hits out of 5 at 1,800 meters, earning grudging approval from Muller. Better. But notice how the wind has increased. At 2,000 meters, these same conditions would make consistent accuracy nearly impossible. Hans Zimmermann had been watching this progression with growing interest. From his vantage point, he could see things the soldiers below could not, the way the wind currents flowed around the mountain faces, creating predictable patterns that repeated every 15 to 20 minutes. The way thermal columns rose from sun-warmed rock faces, creating vertical air currents that could be read by someone who understood the mountain's moods. By noon, not a single trainee had managed a consistent hit beyond 2,000 meters. The wind had intensified, and Muller decided to demonstrate why the 3,000-meter target remained untouched. "Observe, gentlemen," he said, taking position behind the training rifle, a precision instrument worth more than most automobiles. "I will attempt what I consider the practical limit of marksmanship in these conditions, 2,200 meters." Muller was not boasting. His service record included confirmed kills at extreme range during peacekeeping operations in the Balkans. His calculations were meticulous, his form perfect. The shot was fired with textbook precision. The bullet struck low and left of the target, missing by nearly 2 meters. "This," Muller announced without embarrassment, "is why we understand our limitations. At 2,200 meters in these wind conditions, even perfect technique cannot guarantee success. Physics becomes the enemy of certainty." He gestured toward the 3,000-meter target. "That plate has stood unmarked for 7 years. Every military unit that trains here attempts it. None succeed. It serves as a reminder that some achievements belong to legend, not reality." Hans Zimmermann heard these words carried on the wind. For a moment, his weathered face showed something that might have been amusement. He had been listening to similar declarations for most of his 73 years. During the war, German instructors had made comparable claims about Swiss defensive positions being impossible to assault. During the Cold War, visiting NATO officers had dismissed local knowledge as quaint mountain folklore. The mountains, Hans knew, kept their own counsel about what was possible. As the afternoon training session began, Hans made a decision that surprised even himself. He gathered his shepherd's crook, whistled once to his dog, a signal that meant, "Watch the flock," and began walking down the mountain slope toward the training facility. His approach did not go unnoticed. Sergeant Moreau spotted him first, pointing toward the descending figure. "Instructor, we have a civilian approaching the range." Muller looked up, slightly annoyed by the interruption. Military training exercises were supposed to be secure, though local shepherds occasionally wandered near the boundaries. "Probably lost. I'll redirect him." As Hans drew closer, the soldiers could see he was older than they had initially thought, but he moved across the rough terrain with the sure-footedness of someone born to these mountains. His clothing was well worn but practical, and his eyes held an alertness that suggested keen intelligence. "Entschuldigung," Hans called out in Swiss German, then switched to accented English. "I do not wish to interrupt your training. But I have been watching from the mountain, and I wonder if perhaps I might offer a small suggestion." Muller's response was polite but firm. "I'm afraid this is a restricted military exercise, sir. For your safety, I must ask you to maintain distance from the firing line." Hans nodded respectfully. "Of course. But I could not help noticing that your soldiers struggle with the 3,000-meter target. In the old days, we sometimes had success at such distances." "The old days?" Lieutenant Weber asked with poorly concealed skepticism. "During the war," Hans replied simply. "When accuracy meant the difference between freedom and occupation." There was something in his tone that made the soldiers pay closer attention. Muller's expression shifted from mild annoyance to professional curiosity. Switzerland's role in World War II was complex, officially neutral but privately resistant to any power that threatened Alpine independence. "You served during the war?" Muller asked. "In a manner of speaking." Hans's answer was carefully neutral. "I spent considerable time in these mountains when accuracy mattered most." Captain Rossi, the Italian, leaned forward. "You're saying you could hit the 3,000-meter target?" Hans studied the distant steel plate, barely visible through the dancing heat waves and swirling mountain air. For a long moment, he seemed to be reading something in the landscape that the others could not see. "The wind patterns today are actually quite favorable," he said finally. If one understands how the air moves through these particular valleys. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years afterward. Muller, perhaps driven by professional pride or simple curiosity, made an offer that surprised everyone present. "Very well, sir. If you believe you can succeed where trained military marksmen have failed, I invite you to demonstrate. But I must warn you, this rifle is worth 50,000 francs. Military precision equipment requires considerable experience to operate safely." Hans examined the weapon with hands that moved with surprising familiarity across its mechanisms. "Ah," he said softly, "a Schmidt and Bender scope. German glass, very good. Though I confess I am more familiar with older systems." He shouldered the rifle, and instantly his entire demeanor changed. The somewhat frail-looking shepherd disappeared, replaced by someone whose stance spoke of decades conditioning muscles to hold steel steady against a target's life. His breathing shifted to the controlled rhythm of a professional marksman. "The wind," Hans murmured, more to himself than to the watching soldiers, "comes down from the Jungfraujoch, splits around the Manche, creates a predictable eddy behind the ridge line. Every 18 minutes, approximately, there is a calm period lasting 40 to 50 seconds. Muller checked his chronometer, genuinely intrigued now. "How could you possibly know that?" "I have watched these mountains breathe for 73 years, Hans replied, settling into shooting position with fluid efficiency. "They speak to those who listen." The soldiers gathered around, no longer skeptical but genuinely curious. Something about Hans's absolute confidence, the way he handled the rifle, the precision with which he read environmental conditions, it all suggested experience far beyond civilian hunting. Hans began his calculations, but not with the electronic aids the soldiers relied upon. Instead, he watched grass movement at multiple elevations, noted the behavior of thermal currents rising from sunlit rock faces, observed how dust moved in the valley below. His adjustments to the scope were minimal but deliberate. In 1943, he said conversationally while fine-tuning his position, there was a German observation post on that ridge line. He indicated a peak roughly 2,800 meters northeast of their position. They had excellent optics, radio communication with their artillery. Very problematic for certain activities that required discretion. Lieutenant Weber's eyes widened slightly. "You're saying you engaged targets at that distance during the war?" "I am saying," Hans replied carefully, "that sometimes mountains provide solutions to problems that seem impossible from the valley floor." He settled fully into position, his breathing slowing to the controlled rhythm that marks a true professional. The wind chose that moment to shift, dropping to barely perceptible movement. Hans noticed immediately. "Now," he said quietly, and fired. The rifle's report echoed off the surrounding peaks, creating a cascade of sound that seemed to roll around the entire valley. Through the spotting scope, Muller tracked the bullet's path, a journey that would take nearly 4 seconds to complete across 3,000 meters of variable air density, wind currents, and thermal columns. The soldiers held their breath, though they knew the result would not be visible to naked eyes at this distance. Only through high-powered optics could they confirm what Hans had achieved. At the 3,000-meter target, the steel plate rang with a sound like a struck bell. The bullet had found its mark with precision that defied every calculation the soldiers had made during their morning attempts. But Hans was not finished. While the soldiers were still processing what they had witnessed, he fired again. Then a third time. Each shot found the steel target, the impacts grouped within a pattern that professional marksmen would consider remarkable at 800 meters, let alone 3 kilometers. Muller lowered his spotting scope slowly, his face showing the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. "Unmöglich," he whispered in German. "Impossible." Hans rose from shooting position, handed the rifle back with the same care he had received it, and checked his simple mechanical watch. "The wind will shift again in approximately 3 minutes, he observed. After that, such shots become much more difficult until evening thermal conditions stabilize. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of cowbells from Hans's flock, still grazing peacefully on the mountainside where he had left them. Lieutenant Weber was the first to find his voice. "Who are you?" Hans considered the question with the same careful attention he had given to wind patterns and bullet trajectories. "I am Hans Zimmermann. I tend sheep in these mountains, as my family has done for generations." "But during the war?" Captain Rossi pressed. "During the war, many Swiss did what was necessary to preserve our independence," Hans replied. "Some served openly in the military. Others contributed in different ways." Muller, recovering from his shock, began to understand. "You were part of the resistance network. The civilian militia that coordinated with Allied intelligence." Hans's silence was answer enough. Switzerland's official neutrality during World War II masked a complex reality. While the government maintained diplomatic relations with all powers, civilian networks throughout the Alps provided crucial intelligence to Allied forces, guided downed airmen to safety, and occasionally eliminated threats that could not be addressed through official channels. "How many?" Sergeant Moreau asked quietly. "Numbers are not important," Hans replied. "What mattered was preserving the freedom to walk these mountains without fear. To raise sheep where my grandfather raised sheep. To ensure that future generations could train here in peace rather than fight here in desperation." He gestured toward the surrounding peaks. "These mountains have witnessed many marksmen over the centuries. Some fought for conquest, others for defense. The stone remembers them all equally." Muller approached Hans with newfound respect. "Sir, would you consider sharing some of your knowledge with these soldiers? Your understanding of Alpine shooting conditions could save lives in future operations." Hans looked at the young faces surrounding him, professionals who had come to learn in the mountains that had taught him everything he knew about precision, patience, and the difference between confidence and competence. "Perhaps," he said finally. "But first, they must understand that marksmanship in these conditions is not about technology or calculations. It is about reading the mountain's moods, respecting its power, and knowing when to take the shot and when to wait for better conditions." What followed was an impromptu masterclass unlike anything in the formal curriculum. Hans demonstrated how to read wind patterns by observing vegetation at multiple elevations, how thermal columns could be predicted by watching shadow movement on distant rock faces, how the acoustic properties of mountain valleys could reveal atmospheric conditions invisible to instruments. "Your electronic devices are excellent," he explained to the fascinated soldiers, "but they measure conditions only at your position. In mountain shooting, you must understand the environment between you and the target, how wind behaves differently at various altitudes, how temperature gradients affect bullet trajectory across kilometers of varied terrain." He pointed to seemingly empty air above the valley. "There, at perhaps 1,800 meters from here, there is an invisible river of air flowing northeast. Your bullet must cross it twice, once rising, once falling. The electronic calculator cannot account for this because it cannot see what is not measured." Lieutenant Weber took careful notes as Hans continued his explanation. "In the old days, we had no rangefinders, no ballistic computers. Survival depended on reading the mountains themselves." "How did you learn these techniques?" Captain Rossi asked. Hans's expression grew distant. "Trial and error. Necessity. And from an old hunter named Klaus Brenner who could hit chamois at distances most men could not even see them. He fought in the mountains during the Great War, understood how alpine conditions affect shooting better than anyone I have known." "Is he still alive?" Muller asked. "Klaus died in 1961, Hans replied. "But he taught me that knowledge means nothing unless it is passed forward. That each generation must teach the next, or wisdom dies with the man who carries it." The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows when Hans finally prepared to return to his flock. The soldiers had filled notebooks with observations about mountain shooting that were not found in any manual, techniques developed through decades of necessity rather than theory. "Before you go," Muller said, extending his hand formally, "I want to thank you. And to ask, would you consider allowing us to document these techniques officially? Future classes could benefit enormously from your knowledge." Hans shook the offered hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to physical work. Documentation is fine, but remember, the mountain teaches differently each day. What works in today's conditions might fail tomorrow. The secret is not memorizing techniques, but learning to listen. He looked around at the faces of the soldiers who had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their careers. You came here to learn about limits. But perhaps the greater lesson is that limits often exist only in our understanding, not in reality. As Hans walked back up the mountain slope toward his waiting sheep, the soldiers watched with a respect that had been entirely absent a few hours earlier. His figure grew smaller against the massive Alpine backdrop, but somehow seemed to belong to the landscape in a way that suggested deep, permanent connection. "Instructor," Lieutenant Weber said quietly, "will you include today's events in your official report?" Muller considered this carefully. "What would I write?" "That a 73-year-old shepherd demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything in current military manuals. That techniques exist which cannot be replicated without decades of intimate familiarity with specific terrain." He looked at the distant 3,000-meter target, still bearing the marks of Hans's impossible shooting. "Some achievements defy documentation, gentlemen. They exist not as procedures to be copied, but as reminders of what becomes possible when skill meets deep understanding." Sergeant Moreau was studying the mountain slope where Hans had disappeared among his sheep. "Do you think we'll see him again?" "Perhaps," Muller replied. "These mountains have been home to his family for generations. Men like Hans Zimmermann do not simply vanish, they become part of the landscape they serve." As the soldiers packed their equipment and prepared to return to the base camp, each carried with them a new understanding of what they had witnessed. Not simply exceptional marksmanship, but the demonstration of knowledge that could not be taught in classrooms or acquired through technology, wisdom earned through decades of intimate relationship with an environment that demanded nothing less than perfect attention. The wind picked up again as evening approached, making the kind of precision shooting Hans had demonstrated virtually impossible. But by then, the lesson had been delivered with perfect timing, as precisely calculated as the shots that had found their mark at 3,000 meters. 6 months later, a small plaque was installed near the 3,000-meter target at the Thun Military Training Center. It read simply, "Hans Zimmermann Range, in recognition of mountain wisdom and the guardians who preserve it." Hans himself never saw the plaque. He continued tending his sheep in the high pastures, as his family had done for generations, carrying knowledge that connected him to every marksman who had ever learned to read the wind in these ancient mountains. The steel target at 3,000 meters remained in place, still nearly impossible to hit consistently in alpine conditions. But now the soldiers who trained there understood that impossible was simply another word for the gap between current ability and lifetime mastery. Hans Zimmermann never asked for recognition or monuments. He simply demonstrated what becomes possible when deep knowledge meets perfect opportunity, when mountain wisdom finds expression through human skill, and when legends reveal themselves not through boasting, but through quiet competence that speaks louder than any words. Because that's what true legends do. They don't announce themselves with fanfare. They appear when needed, share what they know, and return to the mountains that made them, leaving behind only the echoes of shots that seemed impossible until the moment they found their mark. Have you ever met someone whose quiet expertise changed your understanding of what's possible? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who carry wisdom in silence, but whose knowledge echoes through the generations. Disclaimer. This video is a fictional narrative created for emotional, inspirational, and entertainment purposes only. The characters, events, and situations portrayed are entirely imaginary and should not be interpreted as factual representations of real-life individuals or events. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real situations is purely coincidental. This content is not intended to offend, deceive, or cause harm. Viewer discretion is advised.